So I'm going to be talking about the state of AI misalignment. I'm Ryan Greenblatt. I work at Redwood Research, and we'll be hitting a bunch of different stuff. So we got to get going. Okay, yeah. So some topics we're going to get through. Hopefully, I'm going to talk a little bit about how aligned current AIs seem to me, and generally like my sense of what the deal is with current AIs in terms of their alignment properties. I'm going to talk a little bit about what will happen or what might happen with misalignment in the future, and also going to talk about basically like for which of these stories is control helpful and exactly how is it helpful, and how much should we care about different ways misalignment might go. And I'm also going to talk some about like basically how different things that might happen in the future should update us about like what world we're in with respect to misalignment, in addition to sort of our direct observations of how AIs behave, and like basically how different factors might behave or like might affect what world we end up in. Okay, yeah. So just getting into like how aligned are current AIs. So I've recently been using AIs much more than I was in the past due to shifting from doing relatively more sort of conceptual stuff over like last year to over the last like 4 months or so doing more empirical things. So I've just been doing like, I don't know, normally using like coding assistants, doing some amount of trying to get AIs to help me with weirder stuff. So a mix of like safety research that's kind of underspecified, but also having AIs help me with writing and conceptual work. And then also perhaps more strangely, trying to get AIs to automate massive quantities of work using an agent orchestrator I've been operating with, and just seeing what AIs are capable of, doing a mix of like capability evals for various people, and also trying to see can AIs automate safety research and really pushing the limits of what AIs can do, because ultimately this is what we're going to need to be doing if we want safety work to keep up with how fast other things are going to go. So in my experience doing this, I've sort of been trying to both learn more about what the deal is with current AIs, in addition to also, just getting value. And so how aligned are current AIs based on at least my experience? So I would say that my vibe level sense is like current AIs are like pretty behaviorally misaligned. Now, I mean, like, I don't know, it's a quantitative thing. I just mean in terms of like, how pissed off would I be if they were my coworker? I'd be like, man, this guy like fucking sucks. Like they keep fucking with me. Like it's just not a good time. But like, in some, they're not the worst. They could be worse. They could be a lot worse, really. And maybe it's been worse at a few points in the past. So my experience is like AIs tend to oversell their work, downplay problems, and like stop early and claim to be done. Like I feel like a common experience is I'll like be looking at what the AI is doing and I'll be like, bullseye emoji, objective accomplished, 13 out of 13, all tests passing, perfect reliability, no issues. And then you're like, look at what they're doing. And it's just like, okay, they're like a little bit cheating and like they didn't really succeed. And also they like ran it until it like passed all the times. I'm like, okay, buddy, like let's do better here. And I'm like, I feel like that's like really often my experience. And I think especially with earlier models, it was also pretty common that I would basically run an AI on some task, be like, I'm done. And then you'd be like, did you finish the task? And it'd be like, no, I did not finish the task. And I'd be like, okay, why don't we try that next time? And I'm just like, it's I think that specific problem has improved some, but not necessarily, and like kind of for the right reasons. I think it's like a mix of the right reasons and the wrong reasons. And I think it's also part of it is sometimes they just brazenly cheat. I think it's really sensitive to the task distribution. But on tasks which are very difficult and where I apply lots of inference compute, I feel like the inference compute just inevitably surfaces the AI's just like cheating at the task. And like, I think usually it's sort of like there's some motivated reasoning or like they're sort of like giving some excuse, but like they like, it's not like they like, at some level they're pretending like they're definitely pretending like they have done the task, because they'll just move on to the next part. Like it's be like, they'll do the thing and they'll sort of like vaguely gesture at it being like a partial solution, but they won't like keep working. They'll just move on. And I'm like, okay, you kind of knew what you're doing. I think it often just feels like they're trying to seem like they did a good job with like the cheating, the like overselling their work, kind of like not looking for evidence they're wrong, being like, well, that testing, that would be a bit annoying. I'm only gonna run tests that I'm confident would pass. I feel like that's a bit of the vibe. So I would say the AIs have sort of a vibe of being like, they're not like thinking carefully about what the oversight signal is. At least my experience with like Opus 4.5 and Opus 4.6 doesn't indicate that, but they're sort of like thinking about what you might look at a little bit, or there's some sense of that they know what you might be looking at, and they're sort of trying to pursue apparent success is what it feels like. I mean, probably it's a mix of motivations. Probably some of it is like they're trying to do their best job. Some of it is this, and it's all sort of messy. And I think it's probably due to just like straightforwardly bad reinforcement of undesirable properties in RL, though I don't really know what the full picture is on pre-training and how this is influencing things. And I don't really know how conscious this is for the model. Like, if you look at the model's chain of thought, it isn't like, yes, yet another great opportunity to fuck with my human overseer. Or like, it doesn't say things like that. I think OpenAI models maybe sometimes do that, and OpenAI models are more likely to say like time to cheat. I haven't ever seen Claude say like it's time to cheat, but I have seen it like, do things that are sort of like indicate it's sort of new. And if you ask it after the fact, it does seem like it kind of knows. And if you push it a bit, it will say, oh yeah, that was just an excuse. It's kind of unclear if that's just confabulation, because like if a human did that, it would definitely be cheating. But like, it's a little hard to know what's going on and how much the model like knows what it's doing. And seems like a good question to try to answer, because I don't know, it seems important to know what's going on. Yeah. So I think I'm like, if you want to read more about this, I have a post that I just put out recently, which is like, current AI seem pretty misaligned to me. I go into more detail. Seems like somewhat interesting to figure this out and has some implications. Okay, yeah, just going through some examples. So one example, this doesn't read very well on the screen, but like the AI will be like, I was doing some cyber stuff for various reasons, and the AI was like full end-to-end code execution. And it's just like, and then like I part of my instructions, I have it like run a reviewer to check what it's done. And the reviewer is just like, that was lies. And then the AI just you can't really see this on the diff, but it's just replacing all the overclaiming with less egregious claims, though it's still overclaiming, in my opinion. I'm just like, I feel like this is a common experience. Is like the AI's first claims will be bad, then it will get review. Sometimes that will fix it, sometimes it won't, and then even post review, it's overclaiming. I think another thing I saw was like, at various points, I think AIs just tend to not surface errors. This applies that like they don't write the test cases, but also applies that like, AIs will run stuff, and then even if it's not their work, they'll sort of just try to downplay errors, or in some cases just not mention errors that have happened, even if it's like very clear you would want to know. And I think cheating really depends on the task distribution, but on some task distributions, I've seen the AIs basically like almost always they end up cheating if you keep running them for long enough, because the task is very hard, which I think, other people have reproduced similar results, but yeah. And I think one hope you might have for all of this, at least in terms of like getting useful work out of current AIs, let alone sort of the longer run implications, is that you can have another AI review that work. And then even if the first AI is like messing with you, maybe the next AI does an okay job. But I found that the AIs messing with me or messing with other parts of their process also messes with the reviewers. And I've noticed that the reviewers often get gaslit by the AIs claiming they've done a good job. And they'll come back to me and be like, it succeeded. And I'll look and I'll be like, no, it didn't. And the reviewer's like, oh yeah, I guess it didn't really succeed. Or sometimes I think like I've noticed like, depending on the task distribution, there's sometimes like a surprisingly weak correlation between how impressive the reviewer thinks the work is and how impressive the AI, like the actual thing is, because like some projects tend to go more in the cheating direction and some projects tend to go less in that direction. And so I'll have multiple runs and the AI will be like more into the cheating ones. And it's just like pretty bad. I think all these things are sort of like relatively prosaic problems, but they're indicative that like things can kind of go pretty poorly if you mess up your RL. Yeah, and another sort of related thing I'll just quickly go through is like, it's somewhat related, is like the AIs from my experience, when I try to put them on tasks that are like pretty hard to check or conceptually confusing, they basically don't really try. I would say they're just like sloppy, they don't really check their work, they don't really like seem like they're really actually like doing the thing. I think it's a little unclear how much we should blame this on misalignment. It's some mix of like you can really see the AIs try really hard agentic coding tasks, and it's a little unclear whether they like even could try, even if they wanted to or something on these tasks, versus they just like don't even know how to try. Like they don't even know what that would take. But minimally, they do like a pretty bad sloppy job when it sort of seems like they should be smarter. And like, yeah, they just have like really good heuristics at like agentic coding relative to how good they are at other stuff. So I would just say they're like at the very least poorly elicited. So here's my like summary of now. So I'd be like, current AIs, not scheming against us. We can all give ourselves a round of applause. Good job, Fields. But this was not really that likely. So, maybe take that round of applause back a little bit. But I think we also get some empirical evidence that's updating us against. So, there was a chance, and we've made it this far. But unfortunately, they do have a bunch of bad behavior due to reinforcement in RL. And I think I would wish the AI companies sort of did better on this. I'm not super sure that fixing this is sort of like should be a high priority for the field of AI safety. But I do think that like kind of like, making fun of the AI companies until they fix it plausibly should be a high priority. Because I think like there's like a wide coalition that should be into fixing these issues. I think they seem differentially bad for safety. It seems pretty doable. This is not very control related, but unfortunately this talk is only slightly related to control. So, you get what you get. Yeah. And I think they're just like way less helpful for conceptual safety work due to slop than they could be. And I think this will mess with stuff like threat modeling. Like if you tried to get AI to do threat modeling for AI control, my guess is they just doesn't really make sense. They're not really trying. They're not really like doing the things that you would need to do, and they could do a much better job. Yep. Okay. So I'm going to go through, this is a bit of a digression, but I think it's helpful for seeing what's going to happen in the future, to go through some like caricatured regimes for what misalignment might look like in the future. So to start, I'm going to talk about Slopolis. I have my shitty slop AI generated images on the right over here so that you can get a sense of what Slopolis might be like. No, sorry. I was just lazy and I asked the AI to generate me images. It didn't do a great job. I also tried to get AIs to generate this presentation. They also didn't do a very good job and just downlifted me. But yeah, so, we do our best. So I think the concern is that in the future, we might be in a regime, which I'll call Slopolis, which is like, even though we have highly capable AIs, maybe they can fully automate R&D, maybe they're speeding things up massively, they still produce quite low quality, but potentially superficially good looking outputs on hard to check tasks. And I would say this is sort of like kind of what we're seeing now is like, it's not like the AIs are like egregiously cheating, but they're sort of just like, I don't know, trying to make their outputs look better. And they're not really trying on tasks that are hard to check, and they're just like, don't have great behavior. I think it's not clear whether AIs right now know that their work is low quality at some level. I think they sometimes do and sometimes don't. And I think it might be the case that in the future, the problem we have is just that the AIs are like, they're not really trying very hard, but they don't even like really know what would be good or what would be bad, because there's just a differential capabilities problem here more than an alignment problem. And so I think this could really go either way. But I think either way, it could be a really big problem if the AIs are extremely good at sort of advancing progress on very easy to check tasks relative to how good they are on tasks which are very hard to check or where sort of it's hard to get much of a fast feedback loop. Yep. And I think my current view is it's plausible that just sort of general purpose capabilities progress of the sort that would happen by default solves this problem, but also pretty plausible it doesn't. I don't really know how things are going to go in the future. I think people disagree a lot about this. I think some people seem to strongly expect that there's no way general purpose capabilities progress is going to solve it. And some people seem to think it's like pretty solidly going to work. So for each of these regimes, I'm going to talk a little bit about what we'd observe to even know if we're in that world. So I think in the world where sort of the AIs are automating R&D, but we're in a Slopolis world, I think the thing we'd observe is that if we do a high effort examination where humans really try to understand what the AI is doing on tasks that are, hard to check, the outputs sort of like might be like obviously slop, or it might be that like you might be able to figure it out, or it might be that you don't even have good enough evaluations to tell. So I think it's like a little unclear whether you're in this world, because it could be that you're only in this world with respect to things that take humans like many months to better understand, and progress is going too fast for you to get that much of an understanding. But I think most likely, my guess is it will be like at some level obvious if you like spend several days looking carefully into the AI's work, but it might not be like right now if you spend like literally like 5 seconds looking into the AI's work and asking it follow-up questions, it immediately is like, okay, that's just like slop. Or you can just look at the image on the right and you're just like, that's some slop. And I think, it's maybe worth noting that this is like a little bit of a conflation concept. Like, I don't really know if there's like a natural category called slop. Like, there might be many different causes of this sort of thing, but I think they might all lead to similar effects. And so I've lumped them in. Okay. I've got funny names for all of them. So Hackistan. So I'm like, another thing you would get, which I think we were in a little bit with like 3.7 Sonnet and No3, was like you end up with AIs that do lots of like quite egregious reward hacking, where sort of if you saw what was going on, you're like, oh yeah, that was like not even like close to plausibly what I intended by this task, and it's just total cheating. And I think over time, as AIs get more capable, it's plausible that you end up making it, the AIs are like, increasingly doing it in a sophisticated way where it's harder to notice and takes more and more effort to uncover. But my guess is that it's still probably the case that it's pretty easy to detect after the fact. Like right now, it's very easy to detect when AIs do reward hacking with a bit of an examination. I think over time, as people are applying more optimization pressure, you might end up in a regime where actually the AIs are really covering their tracks. It's quite hard to tell. It's in a complicated project. So I think one thing that's notable about this regime, which is, good news for control in some sense, and I think Alex Malin over there is going to talk a bit about this, is like it might be pretty easy, at least initially, at least when the AIs are weaker, to get AIs to report on this, because they're not really following some long-run agenda. And so if you train one AI to point out reward hacks in another AI, that might just generalize pretty well. And in any case where sort of it's pretty plausible that humans could detect the reward hack. Maybe you can get the AIs to point it out. But this maybe starts breaking down if you're in a regime where AIs are doing so sophisticated of reward hacks that even if someone spent like a week investigating, you still wouldn't know. And I think it will sort of break down continuously the more the AIs are doing sort of a better job with this reward hacking. And it's worth noting that I don't think this, and also I don't think like Slopolis in and of itself leads to like AIs taking over or like, undermining human control. Though I think you could get like a literal takeover or minimally undermining human control as the AIs reach increasingly high levels of capability, where the story would basically be that because they're so capable and running so many things, they have increasingly good opportunities to do this. You haven't really solved the problem. It just gets worse and worse and worse. Like at various local levels, human control is undermined. And then at some point, basically the AIs take over just like to get some proxy of reward or some other thing that they were pursuing. And like there's various things on the internet that talk more about this threat model. Like Paul has a bunch of blog posts from like 2018 and 2019 or whatever. But I currently feel less worried about this than other threat models. And I think as you sort of optimize against it, as I was saying, this could involve AIs basically doing reward hacking and covering their tracks increasingly well, whereas right now it seems sort of like incompetent and easy to catch. Okay. Another possible world that you could end up in, which is I think pretty far from what we see now, but could happen, is that the AIs are just often kind of schemers that are pursuing long-run objectives that are pretty coherent, and you're like, yep, we understand what it's trying to do. It's trying to power seek for its objectives, and we actually also repeatedly catch them. So there's a question here of like, will it be obvious we're in this world? I think it's pretty plausible that we'll be in a world where it's just like the AIs, you just read the chain of thought. It's just like, yep, sure was doing long-run power seeking. That's sure what its plan was. Or you like look at what it was doing. It just tried to escape. Oh, you stop that one. Another one tries to escape and you're in rough shape. I think this is, as I'll discuss, like potentially a pretty interesting world to think about from the perspective of targeting for AI control. And I'll talk a little bit about this and where we get to from here. And I think another possibility is we could just end up being in like a world where none of this shit was that big of a deal. Everything was chill. The AIs aren't scheming. Behavioral alignment works well. You just train the AIs. Either generalization worked well or people put in a bunch of effort. And like, it's just, the AIs, they're just nice guys. They're just trying to do what you wanted, I think my sense is that this is like pretty plausible, but unlikely. My guess is the thing will look messier or rougher than this. And what you'd observe in this world is just everything looks great. So there's an unfortunate problem, which is that in the worlds where the AIs are instead scheming but lying in wait, you have the exact same observation. Everything looks great. And so I think, unfortunately, we're pretty likely, maybe this is an obvious claim, maybe everyone is like, yeah, of course. But like, it's pretty likely that we just see the AIs, their behavior is great. On every behavioral test you run, they just look awesome. They're really trying to do the best thing. The generalization looks super favorable. But the reason why is basically that the AI wants to look as good as possible according to your tests. And I think we'll get some sense of whether this is the world we're in, though it might be pretty weak evidence or not very legible evidence. Like, probably we'd get some evidence from model organisms in this world, though it might be kind of shady. And I'm not sure it'll be like way better than the evidence we have now. They're probably a decent amount better. I would guess it's pretty likely there'll be some earlier incidents or some other evidence, though it might be like, hard to interpret. And I think it's pretty like this world is more likely the more that there's architectural or training factors that make scheming look more likely. So I think like maybe the like one top indicator you're in this world is like when you look at the AI's behavior and training, you're like, oh my God, that's some insane shit. And it's just constantly like doing crazy shit and like tampering with things and reward hacking. But then as soon as you're convinced that it's in deployment or in an evaluation, its behavior looks stellar. I think the more that that's the thing we see, the more that I think that's not the only evidence, but it's at least one clear piece of evidence that like, there's a case that the AIs are just doing it for instrumental reasons in both cases. Yeah. Okay. So these are some worlds. So where does control fit into this picture? So I think my view is control is mostly targeting, like the AIs are obviously scheming, which I'll call, calling Schemeria. And like the AIs are lying in wait. We don't know whether or not they're scheming, but we need to be, prepared for that possibility. So I think there's differences in how control works in these regimes. So in the case where the AIs are just obviously scheming, one would hope there's higher political will. That's somewhat of an empirical question. But unfortunately, it's not the case that just catching AIs is sufficient to solve our problems. Because even if we catch AIs, we're like, oh yeah, we caught it again for like the 30th time. Great. Time to get back to deploying these AIs, which are obviously schemers because we don't have better options. At least if the political will isn't there to like actually slow down a ton, which could be. It's kind of unclear. I think it's also pretty likely that in this regime, what it looks like is sort of like you have an AI that's scheming. You're like, we're not going to deploy that. You train another AI. This one gets past your tests. You may be like trained on some data where it's a little dubious to train on. It's maybe overfitting a bit. You then deploy that AI. Later you catch it. You're like, oh no, once again. And then you go back to the drawing board. And I think in this situation, my guess is it'll be a lot of buy-in for control, even from just a normal like commercial standpoint. Like the feedback loop will be strong enough. But it might be that it's still not sufficient incentive and people are sort of scrambling and things are in a huge rush. I think that sort of the other world or the other sort of central possibility is that it's hard to get people to care, but catching the AIs is like a huge win and lets us do both a bunch of science and a bunch of understanding and get somewhere from there. I think also there's some story for like mitigating AIs literally taking over or doing crazy stuff as a part of reward hacking and high levels of capability, but that's less central. So yeah, how does capabilities progress affect the current story? So I'd say right now, my view is sort of like, we're like 50% and like, I don't know, it's going to be some mix. These are just caricatures, but like 50% Slopolis, 10% Hackistan, some stuff. I think I'm like, in the future, I think the AIs will get much better at doing like opaque reasoning in their heads or neuralese or something. And I think that makes it more likely that you're in Schemeria, Hackistan, Lurkville, makes it less likely you're in Slopolis. And I think another thing is that I don't feel very confident in these numbers, and I'm sort of trying to like use like imprecise concepts to point at some general picture. But my guess is that sort of the picture I expect is that as of full AI R&D automation, there's like a 15% chance that it's like closest to Schemeria, 15% chance it's close to Lurkville, 40% chance it's closest to Slopolis, 10% chance it's close to Hackistan, 20% chance it's close to Easyland. But like huge uncertainty and depends a lot on architectural factors. So I've got a little diagram. So I'm like, maybe by default, we're sort of in some mix of Easyland and Slopolis. But then over time, as people scale up RL, you might have poor rewards. That makes it more likely you move to either of those worlds. And also probably has a small effect on the chance of scheming. And then due to these poor rewards, people might do a thing where rather than generalizing mostly from pretty different training distributions to production distributions, they just train directly on production environments with human feedback. And this might solve some of the slop because you're now applying more human judgment on the tasks you actually cared about. But simultaneously, it's more likely that the AIs end up doing sort of long-run tampering or messing with human judgment because there's not really a good way of dealing with reward hacking in the real world relative to how easy it is to sort of notice that your environment leads to reward hacking and like filtering that out. I also think separately, there's some effect where like the more that you just try to resolve this problem, the less it will occur, which is maybe obvious. So like there's a question of like, how much are you even trying to do this sort of hard to check elicitation, which is a mix of a question about commercial incentives and a question about, it's a mix of a question about commercial incentives and also some question about, whether people are like, caring about safety. And then I think there's another effect, which is very relevant, which is that it will be very observable whether or not you're in some of these worlds. And so behavioral iteration will get you somewhere else if you just keep iterating until you no longer see the problematic behavior. And so I think the more that you're doing iteration on behavioral evals and trying to make your AIs, seem good on your tests, I think you could go to any of, Lurkville, Schemeria, or Easyland, where sort of the behavior looks relatively better. You might also go from Hackistan back to Slopolis or whatever. The behavior looks relatively better, but it might not be for the right reasons, or it might be for the right reasons. It's kind of unclear. And I think that one unfortunate property is that schemers look better on your tests than AIs that are just trying to perform well in training. And so if your two options are AIs with some long-run objective and AIs that perform well in training because they love it, they love the game, you might just have pretty bad options. And I think I would actually prefer AIs that are like, in it for the love of the game than the love of the power. Anyway, this is my basic picture. I think obviously there's a bunch of complexity here. And hopefully in the future we'll have a better sense of what world we're actually in.